Before we begin, I want to give some context. I'm from South Africa. In the area where I live, we have this thing called load shedding. It's where the government turns off the power in certain parts of the town and city 2 times a day, usually early morning or midday, and then again in the afternoon or late at night, and it stays off for about 2 hours. Now, let's begin with the story. It was mid-December, roughly a week before Christmas. My mother and sister decided to take a little trip for a week, leaving me alone to look after the house and take care of the dog. I was cool with it, mainly because I wasn't really a big fan of traveling. The first week and a half was fine. I mostly played video games in the living room and took my dog for his daily walk, always making sure I locked up my house before I left. My mother had left me some cash if I ever decided to order some takeout, and there was also plenty of frozen food in the freezer. However, things took a turn for the worse on that Thursday night. The electricity would be turned off for 2 hours between 10 p.m. and midnight. During the blackout period, I was chilling in my living room listening to a horror podcast on YouTube while waiting for the power to turn back on. It was about an hour later when I heard some commotion going on outside. At first, I thought it might have been my next-door neighbor's son coming home late like he normally does. To clarify, my neighbor has a gate that leads into their backyard, and that pathway is adjacent to the front of my house. The next thing I knew, it sounded like someone was tearing off the big tarp that covered our front gate. When I went to investigate, I would be lying to you if I told you that I wasn't scared. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest, and my hands were trembling as I looked out one of the front windows. To my horror, someone had removed most of the tarp covering the front gate. No one was out there when I checked. I assumed that I had scared off whoever it was by using my phone's flashlight through the window. They may have been under the impression that the house was empty. If you're wondering where my dog was during all this, he was chilling in my mom's bedroom, which is located at the back of the house. I decided to have him join me in the living room so that he could keep me company, at least until the power came back on. I had this funny feeling that whoever had uplifted the tarp could still be somewhere outside. I continued listening to the podcast on my phone, and about 30 minutes later, I heard what sounded like the tarp being lifted off the fence again, but this time, my dog heard it too and began barking. So, I nervously opened my front door, ready to confront whoever it was trespassing on my property. I shouted, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I would also like to mention that the breed of my dog is a border collie. Despite him being quite small, he has an intimidating bark that sounds like a German shepherd, especially in the dark. The next thing I knew, I heard several sets of footsteps running away. I went out to my front yard to investigate further. The intruders had torn off most of the remaining tarp. I decided to rip down the rest, as it would have to be replaced. That's when I noticed that the gate was hanging loosely on its hinges, indicating that they may have been trying to steal the gate and sell it for scrap. The very next day, my mother and sister came back from their trip. I told them about what happened. The following day, I was sent to a shop to purchase a security lock that came with an alarm. So if somebody tries tampering with it, or tries to remove the gate, the alarm will go off. I know that the story doesn't seem all that scary, but hearing something outside your house in the pitch dark was quite frightening to me at that moment. I have heard many stories of home invasions and murders happening during the blackout periods, so I consider myself very lucky. I'm an American-born woman, but my mother is from South Africa. She immigrated to the States in the 1990s. When I was growing up, she always taught me to be on guard and to be extremely cautious. It was simple things like driving up to an ATM at night. While my mom was using the machine, I had to look out one of the windows, while my sister would look out another, so that we could see if someone was coming. I had always wanted to visit South Africa, and when I was 17, I went as a graduation present. I ended up staying with my grandparents, who were both in their late 70s. My grandmother was hell-bent on showing me as much of the country as possible, even though my grandfather's Alzheimer's was worsening, and traveling for him was becoming much more difficult. Regardless, we took off from Johannesburg, heading toward Cape Town. We would drive up to 6 hours at a time. Anyone who has ever been to South Africa knows that you can go hundreds of miles and see nothing but grass. It was incredibly scenic, but also eerie. Once we got to Cape Town, we began passing signs that said, "Do not pull over for people selling grapes." We were near the vineyards, and people would sometimes steal the grapes and then try reselling them on the side of the road. It was around 3 or 4 that day. My grandfather was becoming antsy. He was fidgeting with the GPS of the car, plugging it in and unplugging it again, cursing and getting frustrated. Eventually the thing just kept repeating, recalculating, over and over again. My patience was wearing thin. I was trying to take it from him so that I could fix it, but he wouldn't let me touch it. Eventually my grandmother had enough and pulled over. This stretch of road was narrow and was lined by trees. Since it was around mid-afternoon, we were the only car in sight, and it was quiet. My grandparents were reading the GPS instructions and arguing with each other. My grandmother then turns around. "Can you keep watch out of the back window?" I kind of smiled to myself, remembering what my mom used to tell me. I glanced at my phone, which had no signal, then scrolled through my camera roll. I casually looked up and turned towards the back window. That's when my heart stopped. A man had emerged from the forest and was running, full sprint, towards our car. I found my voice and yelled, "Go!" to my grandmother. Her instincts kicked in, and we took off. As we drove away, the man just stood there and watched us. My grandmother explained that when travelers would pull over for the grape sellers, there would be people waiting in the trees who would come out to rob you. It doesn't get much more vulnerable than a teenage girl with an elderly couple, one of which was suffering from Alzheimer's. I'm incredibly grateful to my mother and my grandmother for teaching me to be cautious. This story happened over 10 years ago, when I was still a student. It does contain a few details of graphic violence and animal cruelty, so discretion is advised. A bit of backstory. As is the case with most students, I was always broke. I had a few ventures apart from my part-time job to bring in extra money. One of them was house and pet sitting. I've always had a love for animals, so when this couple contacted me to house sit for them while they were away on an overseas trip, I jumped at the opportunity. The last sitter had bailed on them, leaving a 6-month-old golden retriever all alone. The fact that they promised to pay me the full 2-week fee for staying just a few days was all the more appealing. Little did I know how bad this would all turn out. I got the details and the keys from the agent and headed over to the house. I arrived there after 5 p.m. and it was almost dark. This was around early springtime. It was a very nice place, but it bordered a not-so-good area that was very prone to crime, house break-ins and robberies, etc. This didn't bother me much because I thought that nothing would happen to me. I know, I was young and naive. The first 4 nights went smoothly. I watched movies, relaxed in their jacuzzi, and just generally enjoyed myself. The owners wouldn't be returning until the 5th day, fairly late at night. On the last day, I get a call from them at about 10 p.m. They said that their flight would be delayed, and that they were going to stay at a hotel and do a 3.5-hour drive back the following morning. They asked if I could sleep there again one more night, which was fine by me. I had already been staying there and still had my overnight gear. I called my dad to let him know about the change of plans. I was still living with my parents at the time. He specifically asked me for the address. I normally didn't want to give him details like that, because I thought I was old enough to look after myself. But I still believe to this day, that probably saved my life. I eventually go to sleep at around 1 a.m. It felt like I was only down for 5 minutes when I hear a window breaking. As soon as I sat up, I heard what sounded like footsteps rushing down the hallway. The first thing I did was grab my phone and hit the redial button. My dad was the last number I called, and I was hoping that he would wake up as soon as he heard his phone ringing. However, when I was getting myself off the bed, I dropped the phone and it slid between the headboard and the mattress. But I did not hang up. If my dad picked up, he would be able to hear what was going on. A man then stormed into the bedroom. I could see that he had a knife in his hand. When he saw me, he raised it above his head and came at me. One thing that I forgot to mention is that this story takes place in South Africa, and unfortunately South Africa has a lot of crime. The robberies and home invasions are usually very brutal and violent. People are murdered and tortured if they retaliate in the slightest or don't cooperate with the intruders. I fell back onto the mattress, and out of instinct, once he came within reach, I kicked out both legs as hard as I could. Now, I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'3", and at this time I weighed about 220 pounds, and I was fit and strong. When I wasn't at school or working, I was usually at the gym lifting weights. At that time I could easily bench 250, and my squat was about 350. When my foot made contact with the intruder, it completely lifted him off the ground and sent him flying into the wall. Luckily, the knife fell out of his hand as well. Before he got a chance to get up, I was on top of him, driving my right knee into his face. I knew that my life was hanging in the balance, so I put some extra force into it. The guy dropped like a sack of potatoes. But before I could get up, I heard the sound of a slide racking back on a pistol, and I froze. It felt like all the blood drained from my body, and I became numb. I remember the only thing that went through my head was that if I was shot, I would rather die than be disabled. The second intruder held the pistol against my head for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 10 seconds. He eventually spoke in broken English. He told me to get on the bed and face down. I was panicking, but I knew he would shoot me if I did not comply, so I did as he said. He threw the blanket over me, and I turned into the fetal position with my back against the wall, just so if he wanted to stab me, my legs and arms would protect my body. Now, during all this commotion, I had completely forgotten that I called up my dad, and he could hear everything that was going on. I heard a third man come into the room. I heard him talking to the man with a gun. It sounded like he was speaking Portuguese. I didn't understand what he said, but I could vaguely recognize the dialect. The man who had entered the room tried to get the first guy off the ground, while the other began to ransack the house. It was about this time that I heard tires screeching as a car pulled up outside the house. I soon heard someone shouting. It took me a second to realize that it was my dad. The 3 men inside the house began to panic and ran out of the back door, but my dad opened fire, shooting in their general direction. Now, I do know that my father missed them on purpose, because if he had wanted to shoot them, He would have. He's ex-military and an expert marksman who has won shooting competitions in the past. However, given the politics of South Africa, along with the racial divide, he would have been in big trouble if he had actually killed one of them, regardless of the circumstances. When it was all over, we called the police and walked out to my dad's car to wait for them. It took them over an hour to get there. There was some excuse about having no vehicle when the call came in. By that time, I had calmed down and began looking for the dog. I couldn't find her anywhere. I borrowed a flashlight from my dad and started scanning the surrounding yard. As I got to the corner, I saw her lying on the ground. She was dead. The police found a few pieces of meat that were laced with poison. This is a pretty common practice for criminals around here. It's a way for them to deal with watchdogs at a place that has been targeted for a robbery. I was fuming. The police turned out to be pretty useless as well. They really didn't even seem to care. By that time, the sun was beginning to rise. I retrieved my bag, phone, locked up the house as best as I could without touching anything, and drove home behind my dad. It was only when we got back that I got my dad's side of the story. He said when he answered my call, the only thing he could hear was shouting and what sounded like fighting going on. When I didn't respond to him, he flew out of the house and raced over. Luckily, he asked me for the address earlier that night, and he knew the area well enough to know exactly which house it was. Now, my dad got there pretty quickly. He stayed on the line the entire time, only hanging up when he stopped at the gate. My parents' house is about 6 miles from there, through a residential area. It was normally about a 20-minute drive. The call duration was 7 minutes and 13 seconds. I met a detective there later that day and gave my full statement. The owners got back around the same time. The rest of that day is a blur, as I was coming down from all the shock and adrenaline. Now, this is not where the story ends. About 7 or 8 months later, I got a call from the detective, telling me that they had caught the guys, and I have to come into a lineup to point them out. I specifically told her that I didn't see any of their faces, as it was dark, and after the guy had held a gun against my head, I had a blanket thrown over me. I could only hear what was going on. I couldn't see anything. She reassured me that they had matched the fingerprints and would show me their photos before the lineup. You may be thinking that this was a bit unethical, but this is South Africa. Things work differently here. They wanted to have as much evidence as possible against them, and you'll understand why in a minute. When I got to the station, it's not like you see in the movies. There's no one-way glass or a separate room. They bring the guys into the same room and have them stand against the wall. The one that I was told was their leader was the man that I had kneed in the face. He looked at me with more hate I had ever seen in my life. He had the eyes of someone that would slit your throat and not blink an eye. His name was Joseph Dragon Sambo. He slid a finger across his neck and made a throat-cutting gesture. You know what I'm talking about. When he left the room, the detective gave me a copy of his rap sheet. He was a real model citizen. 4 counts of murder, 8 or 9 counts of attempted murder, multiple assault charges, over 100 house break-ins, and of course, sexual assault. I was shocked. The detective told me that if I had not taken him out first like I did, I probably would not be alive today. This is also not where the story ends. 3 days later, I get a call from the detective saying that I should be careful, as he had escaped from custody and they haven't been able to track him down yet. I was not worried about it too much, as the robbery was not at my house and I had switched vehicles, so he probably wouldn't be able to locate me. Also, I had obtained my firearms license and carried a pistol on me 24/7. I didn't hear any updates about it until 2 years later, when I saw the detective at a grocery store. We started chatting about the case, and she told me that he was killed during a home invasion. It turns out he broke into the wrong house, and the owner was waiting for him. He was shot one time in the stomach and once in the neck, and thanks to the slow response of the emergency services, he died on the man's living room floor, ridding society of a piece of human garbage. Before we wrap things up, I want to add a bit more information. The 3 men who robbed that house were illegal immigrants from Mozambique. It is a widely accepted opinion in South Africa that over 70% of the violent crime is committed by illegal immigrants, mostly Zimbabwean, Nigerian, and Mozambican descent. Things are set up in such a way that it is easy for them to exploit the system, as none of those countries have an extradition treaty with South Africa. So if things get too hot, they can just flee back over the border and nothing can be done to them. This whole ordeal has made me more vigilant, heightened my situational awareness, and has also made me a bit more paranoid. I now double and triple check all the locks on my doors at night. The flip side is that I have been able to detect and remove myself from a few potentially dangerous situations. I have since immigrated to a safer country. If I hear the slightest noise happen at night, I wake up. Fortunately, Joseph is no longer with us, but to his other 2 cronies, please do stop by sometime. I will arrange your swift departure and reunion with Joseph in hell.